Okay. What's up, everyone? This is Citywide Blackout. We are coming to you live from Stillwater Books in Pawtucket, Mass. This is part of our series of interviews leading up to the Rhode Island Author Festival. It is coming on December 5th. This year will be a virtual event in the event of protecting the public health. And speaking of which, so for the purpose of these interviews, we are keeping a good distance away. We are masked up prior to this discussion and then go right back on as soon as we're done. But I am very excited right now to be joined by my next guest, author Stan Carpenter. He has published 4 books to date, one of them being Alternate History, which I am, of course, a huge fan of. Stan, first off, thank you so much for joining me. It is great to talk to you today.
Max, it's a great honor and a pleasure to be here. And on behalf of all the authors at the Rhode Island Authors Association, thank you for this. Is wonderful to allow us to get out in the public and talk about what we do.
Excellent. Mm-hmm. So let us start with your alternate history title, The Linden Tree.
The Linden Tree.
So this book basically kicks off with Japan pausing their attack on Pearl Harbor.
Right.
U.S. does not enter the war, and everything works out fine. Not quite.
Right.
But give us a quick run through of what basically happens as a result of this.
Right. Well, the scenario essentially is a U.S. submarine on just routine patrol, as they were, discovered the day before what's going to be the Pearl Harbor attack, so this would be 6 December 1941, actually discovers the WWII, which is the mobile strike force, the Japanese carrier force heading towards Pearl Harbor. At first, the commanding officer sets up for an attack, and just before they're to launch torpedoes, it occurs to him that we may get one of these carriers, but they're going to get us, and they'll still go on to Pearl Harbor. So rather than actually attack, they pull back, they go into what's called tattletale. My 30 years in the U.S. by God Navy, I still have some terms, but tattletale is basically where you're trailing behind, keeping an eye on and reporting back. So they report back to Sink-Pack Fleet in Pearl Harbor, which then allows the fleet to sortie and get out, and the Japanese apologize. We were just conducting a usual exercise, and we apologize, and so on and so forth. What that sets up is, since the United States is not engaged in the war, at least not yet, Germany does not declare on the United States, and so Germany is at that point focused on, as they were, on Great Britain, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union, without American interference. And the subplot here, which is going on, is the German nuclear weapons development program, which, if you know anything about that historically, it really didn't go anywhere. They were attempting it, but they never really developed the capability to generate an atomic weapon or nuclear weapon. But in this alternate history, they do. And that is what launches us into the Linden Tree, which I don't know if you can see it, but there is the Messerschmitt 264, which was the German attempt, one of the German attempts to build what they call the America bomber. And the idea being there to have a heavy 4-engine bomber that had the legs or the range to actually get to North America and back. And in this particular alternate history, I take one of those that actually existed and called it the Linden Tree, named after the ancestral estate of the commanding officer, who is the main character. He's a Luftwaffe general who is very anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, but being a good Prussian, patriotic German, of course, cheery aye, yes sir, no sir. And as the novel develops, he becomes more and more estranged, if you will, from the governmental, the Nazi hierarchy. And of course, I won't tell you how he actually plays this out. You have to read the book, but that's essentially the scenario.
Okay. So this being alternate history, obviously your knowledge of history only goes so far. At some point, you basically just make it up as you go along.
That's true.
How do you plot it out while being at least somewhat historically accurate so the historians don't look at this and say, that would never happen, you just went off completely off the deep end?
Here is where the advantage of being a classic PhD historian, and particularly a military historian of the 20th century world wars. So what I do, and in fact in the Antimony series, which were the 2 previous novels, which were not alternate history, they're more historical fiction, But even in the Linden Tree, I take historical events, personages, circumstances, and weave them into the story. One of the things that has always distressed me is where you take a real person and make them, for example, a beast or a monster or something that they weren't. Or you place them in situations or have them say or do things that the historical person would never have done. And I think that's the historian in me. An author is incumbent, whether it's you're writing a book, a fiction book, or whether you're doing a movie or TV screenplay. If you're going to use an actual person that existed, I think you're morally obligated to have them do and say things that would have been in character. And so I have a lot of historical characters in this book and my other ones, including Winston Churchill, who I admire greatly and who makes an appearance everywhere. But some of the German historical personages like Himmler and Goering, even the Führer makes an appearance here briefly. But I try to make sure that the way I've reflected them is the way we know them historically to have been. The other thing is, I mentioned earlier that the Messerschmitt 264, which was the Messerschmitt company, their entry into the America bomber program, they actually built 3 prototypes. And I went back and actually found the Messerschmitt company's diagrams of the 264 bomber. And then the graphic artist company that I use then took that and made, as you'll see appearing before the next to the last chapter, it actually shows the diagrams from the Messerschmitt company. So as the reader is going along and say, well, if the pilot goes from this point to that point, all they have to do is look at the diagram and they get a visual image of what the plane looked like and what I'm talking about. So that's, again, part of the historian in me, but that's also making it as close to factual reality as it would have been if this alternate event had occurred in the way it played out. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, as I say, I credit to being a classically trained professor of history. I'm very cognizant of the historical details.
And you could definitely see where the ripples would go after you chuck that rock into the pond.
Yes. Yeah.
Was it fun to like mess with history and play this kind of what if game?
It was. An interesting background. The storyline here actually dates to 1990. It dates to 1990.
So we come right up to the current times.
Yes, indeed. In the copy room of LSA Incorporated in Arlington, Virginia.
Nice.
It just the idea of what might happen had the Kutabutai, the Pearl Harbor attack force, what if it had been discovered, and how might that have rippled on? So that idea, as I say, I remember the date, 1990, and I actually wrote a couple of 3 chapters in that 1990-91 period, and then I put it aside, moved on to other things, had 3 kids, and you know how that works. And in fact, Resurrection of Antimony, which was the first novel there, that is not an alternate history. It is historical fiction based on actual events. That dated from 1988. And about 12, 13 years ago, my wife said, get off your expletive deleted and get the thing published. And I did. And so now here we are 3 novels later.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about those ones. So this is part of a 2-part series, the Genesis of Antimony and the Resurrection of Antimony.
Right.
All focusing on the character of Lieutenant John Braithwaite, who is part, I believe, the English military.
He's Royal Navy, yes.
Royal Navy. Mm-hmm. He sort of falls into the role of kind of a secret agent. He's like investigating different things. What happens to get him into this role in the first place, and how does he adapt to it?
Exactly. Resurrection of Antimony takes place in World War II, 1941, after he has retired from the Royal Navy, but he's brought back by Royal Naval Intelligence for a very specific mission. And I'll tell you how that one evolved shortly. But that did so well, I said, well, shucks, let's write the prequel. And this actually is the 2nd edition of Resurrection. The first edition came out in 2009. Did okay. I wasn't all that thrilled with the publisher. And then I had an opportunity to get a new publisher who incidentally is a former executive vice president for sales and marketing of Ingram Books, which a name you'll recognize since they're the world's largest book distributor. So he started his own publishing outfit, and I'm just thrilled with the way they've turned out. So Resurrection of Antimony, and I said, okay, let's do, if I'm going to do a second edition, make a few changes just to make it fit with the prequel, to introduce Braithwaite in the First World War. And so the opening chapter of Genesis of Antimony is he is an officer on board a British Royal Navy destroyer. They're escorting a coal convoy, and a German cruiser is attacking the convoy. And even though they're outgunned seriously, outmanned, they launch off and try to attack the German cruiser. Well, the ship is sunk. He survives, but with a pretty serious wound. And the docs say, you're not going out to sea anytime soon. At that point, because he spent a lot of time in East Africa growing up, his father was a diplomat, and he spoke fluent German, and then Captain Reginald Hall, later Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Hall, who was the Director of Naval Intelligence, grabs him and says, we've got a job for you, son. You're not going back out to sea anytime soon. We have a job for you. And
it's a heck of like a job pitch.
Yeah, really.
I want to be a secret agent.
How about that? Well, it's a simple assignment. Just go down to Zanzibar and Dar es Salaam, which was in then German East Africa, and see if you can figure out why this German-like cruiser, the Aachen, is able to evade the Royal Navy, and how she can come out, attack British and Commonwealth shipping, and then escape back into the Rufiji River. Well, interestingly enough, that's based on the SMS Königsberg, which actually did that. A German light cruiser in the first year or so of the war would emerge from the Rufiji River, attack shipping, and actually bombarded Zanzibar at one point, but eventually the Royal Navy caught her. Well, I don't know if I should give this away. There's a reason why.
No spoilers.
There's a reason why the Aachen in this case is able to constantly evade and find these ships and evade. Well, we can probably know that or guess today, but this is 1915, and it's brand new technology. Well, that's his mission, and the resident agent, call it our man in Zanzibar, who may not necessarily be a man. You got to have a love interest here. You know,
of course.
So he works with the resident agent, who I won't give it away, and essentially the novel unfolds from there. The finding out of what it is about the Aachen that allows them to escape.
Now, you mentioned your background. You are a retired U.S. Navy captain.
Right.
You're also a professor and historian at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport.
Right.
That's a heck of a long title there.
I am actually Professor Emeritus.
Wow,
just
very
retired
cool.
in March, and in fact, I can't get back into my old office because it's locked.
Oh no!
I was able to escape with enough stuff.
Right. Yeah.
But all my books and all my
no.
mementos, including, and you'll appreciate this, including a piece of the copper plating off HMS Victory.
Oh,
It's still sitting in the office.
You're gonna get that thing back.
Yeah, I know. That's well, a friend of mine who's a former Royal Navy friend for 40 years. The copper plating they took off Victory when they put her in dry dock to make her public back in the 20s, and it was just being stored in a warehouse there at Royal Naval Station Portsmouth. And so some company called Nauticalis, which is a large antiques, nautical, whatever, they got permission to sell about 250 of these plates. And my friend bought one for me and presented it to me. So I have a piece of HMS Victory.
That's a heck of a friend.
But it's still locked up in the office.
Well,
Yeah.
In the meantime, though, the question to you is, what did you have to learn to write these books? It sounds like you more or less have everything like up here, but did you have to do any more research to help fill in the blanks?
Yeah, quite a bit. And one of the advantages of being a professor at the Naval War College, as you might imagine, a lot of, excuse me, I'm okay, no COVID, but is this time of year is just allergies.
I get you.
Yeah, if I start dripping on the table here, that's
dear.
all it is, yeah. It's not the Andromeda strain or anything.
Hey, good literary reference.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
There you go. Well, as I was starting to say before I keeled over, one of the great advantages of being at the Naval War College is, as you might imagine, there's a lot of military, naval, nautical history stuff there in the library. But that is a perfect point to tell you how Resurrection of Antimony came about. This is fascinating. You're a lot younger than me, but you may have seen in the 1980s, Time Life Books came out with a whole series of histories like the aviators, the sailors, the West, the pirates, whatever. Well, their World War II series in the book that was dedicated to the Battle of the Atlantic, and 1988, and I'm just flipping through this thing, and I come across this chapter called The Zany Saga of the Zamzam. I say, what the fill in
It's
the
a
blank?
catchy title.
It is a catchy title, and the Zamzam was an actual ship. She was an Egyptian flag steamer, carried a lot of passengers and freight, and she had started life as a British merchant ship. So she looked a lot like armed cruisers that had been used in First World War and Second World War. And she was sailing, this is March of 41, sailing from New York down to South America, eventually to Cape Town and around Alexandria. Well, she had over 100 Americans on board, mostly missionaries going there. But she also had on board 24 Royal Air Force wives, many of whom recently married and hadn't seen their husbands in a while. They were going to Egypt to be with their RAF pilot husbands. A couple of dozen American volunteer ambulance drivers going to North Africa to drive ambulances for the Free French forces, just like Hemingway did in World War I. Some tobacco buyers from North Carolina, hard-drinking, hard-smoking tobacco buyers, on board this derelict ship with the archetypal Scottish master and chief engineer, the only two Brits on board. Everybody else was a conglomerate of Turks and Lithuanians and whatever. And here they are sailing into the South Atlantic where they're, oh, by the way, German commerce cruisers, particularly the most successful of all, the Atlantis, Raider 16. And you can imagine what happens. And I'm thinking, okay, you got, I don't know if I can use this word, but you know what I mean. Shall we say, probably sexually very energetic young people. You've got missionaries. You've got this whole crew on board this ship sailing into danger. And I will give this away. It was sunk. But it turns out that she was under British Admiralty orders not flying a national ensign during the day or running lights at night, which identified her as a combatant, a combatant. And there is speculation that the Admiralty was trying to create another Lusitania. 100+ Americans on board, sunk by the Germans. The United States is neutral, in an effort to sway the United States towards coming into the war. It didn't work, and only one of the passengers eventually died. The rest of them got back. But the reason why Time Life had this story was on board was then a reporter and a photographer. They were going to cover the war in North Africa. They were on board, and the Germans foolishly let this photographer take a lot of photos. Now, this photographer eventually wound up being the senior editor at Time Life Books, and so I was able to, years and years ago, interview him and his son. But they were eventually repatriated, and in the June 22nd edition of Life magazine appeared this story with photographs of the Zamzam. And I'm thinking, whoa, what a wonderful backdrop. No Hollywood film screenwriter could write a better backdrop for an action adventure, thriller, espionage adventure. And that was the origins of Resurrection of Antimony.
So cool.
Yeah, and on top of that, with historical fiction, of course, what you do is you invent characters and events and lay them on top of the actual historical events.
What percentage would you say is historical and what percentage is fiction?
What's historical and what's fiction? Well, most of the dialogue is, of course, fiction.
Yep.
Because your main driving characters, in this case, Braithwaite, he's, as I said, a retired now senior naval officer brought back on active duty. And even when he is conversing with actual historical personages, for example, William Stevenson, who was known as Intrepid, he was the spy master, if you will, for British intelligence in the Western world. So when they're having conversation, it's of course all created by me. But the circumstances of, say, Stevenson operating out of Rockefeller Center, New York, the British spy master operating in North America, that would tickle the Germans no end to find that out. But so a lot of that's dialogue. I would say the majority of the major historical events are real, like the sinking of the Zamzam, the passengers being taken to France, and so on and so forth. Almost all the dialogue, of course, and the events that the fictional characters are doing, that's created by the author.
Okay.
So
all right.
There's a balance there.
You know, I'm curious as to what got you into writing in the first place, because as mentioned, you have a long career, you have a long career both in the Navy and also as a teacher. What made you want to write?
What made me want to write? I think I get that from my dad, who also was an academic. He was a professor and administrator at North Carolina State, but he loved history. And he dragged us to every battlefield park and every museum that there was.
That's an amazing childhood.
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing.
And so, in fact, all three of his sons went off to University of North Carolina and majored in history.
Wow.
And I kept on with it. Part of being an historian, of course, you have to do a lot of publishing. I'm working on a new book right now on the War of American Independence. I published in British history, the British Civil Wars, World War I, World War II. But along about somewhere in the mid-'80s, I had all these ideas that just floating around, and I just said, well, let me give it a whirl. And I found out I liked it a lot. So I had to write as an historian. If the publisher perish is real. But I really enjoy, I think, more doing the creative, the fictional work.
All right. Now, your fourth book takes a very large chronological jump backwards to the Revolutionary War. This is Southern Gambit, Cornwallis, and the British March, and this basically focuses on their strategy and why it failed.
Right.
Break it down to us. Why exactly did it fail? What happened that just made it not work? Because back then, I know the British were legendary for their prowess on the battlefield.
Yeah, and they were. In fact, Lord Cornwallis, other than the siege of Yorktown, which was a siege, not a tactical linear battle, never lost an engagement where he was in direct command.
Wow.
Yeah, a couple of draws like Princeton, but he was quite extraordinary. The problem with the British strategy, one of the things that we really hammer in on at the Naval War College is something Karl von Clausewitz said, that the first order of business, and I'm just paraphrasing, of anyone who is trying to derive a strategy is you've got to know the nature of what you're getting into. And I advocate that if you don't understand the nature of what you're getting into, whether it be a battle, a war, an economic plan, whatever, if you don't understand the nature of it, your chances of crafting a successful strategy are pretty minimal. And so with that in mind, I've always been fascinated growing up in North Carolina. You might imagine that this is kind of the centerpiece of South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, that Southern campaign that ended the war. And I've always been fascinated as not only that, but as a British historian, classically British history, why exactly with all these advantages, did it fail to restore allegiance to the crown? And I argue in the book that essentially one is they didn't really understand the nature of the war. They're going in attempting to win by classic linear battlefield victories and crush the Continental Army, which Cornwallis does very nicely. Does it a couple of 3 times. But that's not the nature of the war. The nature of the war is you've got to win, it's an overused phrase, but it's still valid, the hearts and minds of the public. The assumption was made which I think is quite true, that the majority of Southerners were in fact loyal, either neutral or loyal. But the assumption was made that as soon as the army shows up, they're going to all show up there, if maybe not in arms, but they'll supply, they'll logistically supply, they'll provide intelligence, that sort of thing. And that didn't happen because the Patriots were so successful at intimidating the Loyalists. So here you have Cornwallis thrashing about in the upcountry, winning battle after battle after battle. Meanwhile, his Loyalist allies are diminishing because they're being beaten in these little small skirmishes. For example, there were more skirmishes or battles just in South Carolina than the entire rest of the colonies combined. But many of them were between Loyalists and Patriots, I mean, American on American. That completely undercut what's known as the Loyalist strategy. Another problem is in command and control. And obviously when you have 3,000 miles away the Secretary of State in charge of the whole thing, Lord Germain, and he's marching off in one strategic direction. Then you have Sir Henry Clinton in New York, the overall commander-in-chief in North America. He has a whole different strategic concept from Cornwallis in the field. So you have this strategic triad, and they're not talking to each other. Or when they do talk to each other, they're not agreeing on any kind of cohesive strategy. So that's the second thing, command and control. And the third thing, which is really part of that command and control, is Cornwallis made a huge mistake by marching inland, because every soldier that he lost through disease, or very few through desertion, but through casualties or whatever, couldn't be replaced. And he could not rely on logistics. That's one of the things that the folks like Francis Marion and Pickens and these guys were great at, is attacking British supply convoys coming up from Charleston and Georgetown into the interior. Well, that meant Cornwallis had to detail many troops just to protect those, so his actual field army was just never sufficient to crush all the opposition. So there were a number of reasons for the strategic incohesion, and I wrote, probably back 2006-07, I wrote a 75-page reading that is still being used in the strategy course at the college. And that really was the genesis of the full book, which actually came out in 2019.
Wow.
Yeah.
What war period would you like to write about the most that you have not had the chance to write about yet?
Not had a chance to write about.
So you've definitely covered a bunch so far.
Yeah. Well, I've done a lot on the British Civil Wars,
sure,
17th century. I've done quite a bit on the War of American Independence. There's an answer to this. I've done a lot.
Figured.
Yeah. I've done a lot on World Wars I and II, not a full-length monograph, but things like journal articles, encyclopedia articles. In fact, I just finished one on the Austro-Hungarian Navy in the First World War, the rise and fall, that's going to be published in December at by the International Journal of Naval History. So a lot of that. The one thing I would like to do, and I'll eventually get to this, is I want to look at 1759, which was a seminal date and I frame it as really the meteoric rise of the British Empire. Because in that year, you had General Wolfe taking Quebec, which was fundamentally important in winning Canada. You had Battle of Quiberon Bay, which pretty much crushed French sea power. You had several events, about 5 or 6 events in that year, 1759, in what we would call here the French and Indian War, but which was more broadly the 7 Years' War. And that really was, I think, the tipping point where the British Empire for the next 200 years just took off in terms of domination of the economy, domination of the seas. So I think to answer that question, that would probably be the next one that I'd like to launch into. But I still got some more American Revolution stuff. I would like to do, since I do admire Cornwallis quite a bit, I would like to do the next biography of him. The last one that was done has been, 1970, so at least 50 years. Very good, but I learned long ago in the history game there are 3 reasons to write a book. One, it's never been done before. Well, can't say that. 2, you've discovered brand new primary sources. No, not really, can't say that. Or 3, it's been at least 25 years since the previous one.
There we go.
It's fair game.
Check that old box. There we go.
Fair game. So
nice.
I would like to continue with looking at Cornwallis and the American Revolution period.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Stan, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been so much fun learning about all these books. But for the folks at home, where do they go to get your books?
Anywhere. They can buy them at Stillwater Books.
That's where we are.
No doubt you're going to line yourself with them. Now, Barnes & Noble, for those folks down on the island, as we say, Quidnick Island, Barnes & Noble in Middletown will carry them on the shelves.
Okay.
You can always special order through any bookstore. I mean, you're happy to call up Ingram and say, hey, I need 62 copies of...
maybe just one of each.
Maybe no one of each. Or the usual things, Amazon
Gotcha.
or Barnes & Noble.
And print and ebook editions available.
Yeah. Now, Linden Tree is out in, has been for about 2 months now in Kindle edition. And according to the publisher, on the 6th of this month, so what, about 3 or 4 days,
Yep.
this will be available. Now, I know that's not strictly true because there's one right there. And I got my copies about 6 weeks ago, so I know they've been printed for a while.
Okay.
But that's what Amazon says. And so you can either pre-order or if you order now, it'll go ahead and go out to you. So it's all the usual sources. Also, here's that crass marketing pitch. If anybody locally, and I've done this with all my books, if anybody would like a signed copy, let me know. And in fact, I just mailed back to an old friend in Virginia, who, by the way, was the guy standing next to me in the copy room at LSA Incorporated in Arlington, Virginia, and said, Rolf, I've got an idea for a book. He just sent to me all 3 of the novels. I signed them and mailed them back to him.
Nice.
So I am, if anybody would like, I am willing to sign for you. I also, until the COVID hit, did an awful lot of library talks at North Kingstown, South Kingstown, Warwick Public Library, Coventry. And if anybody's interested in coming here to hear me speak on these various military history things, I always have the books there and I always sell them and sign them. I don't know when that's going to start up again. I think unlikely this year. But I'm supposed to be talking about World War II in the Pacific and World War II in the Atlantic theaters coming up in South Kingstown Public Library and North Kingstown Public Library starting in January. So if you're interested, you can come hear me speak in these 4-part lecture series and get a copy of the book, and I have pen in hand.
Excellent.
And my standing joke is make sure that you pass it down in your family to previous or following generations, because in 100 years it'll be priceless.
Exactly.
Why? Because it's so rare.
Nice.
Yeah,
nice.
okay. Got to have a punchline.
Exactly. Well, Stan,
Yeah.
once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for the folks, definitely tune in every Friday around 6 p.m. We will be here at Stillwater Books through October, November, and then December 5th, the big day, the Rhode Island Author Expo in virtual format, emceed by yours truly. We'll have forums, we'll have author meetups, a whole lot more. Keep it here, and we'll see you soon.